The Mabinogi is a collection of 11 prose stories collated from medieval Welsh manuscripts. Mabinogi may also refer to a Korean video game. What? Indeed, the game Mabinogi is a massively multiplayer role-playing game that's been around since 2004, but it's only been around for English-speaking crowds since 2008. It's made by Nexon, a Korean company, and they make a whole slew of free-to-play online RPGs. MapleStory is the one for which they are most well known. It's a 2D virtual world, whereas Mabinogi is 3D. Of course, this game is for PC, and you're allowed as in character creation to make your character anywhere from age to 7 to 17. Your character will age within the game for every day. So that's for the stats of the game. Let's go on to the gameplay and narrative. Gameplay and narrative for Mabinogi is difficult to discuss together. This is definitely not a game where I'd say the gameplay and the narrative mesh. It feels much more like a backstep in the world of games. Now, I know that World of Warcraft and Second Life to a certain extent, and a lot of very popular games run on the quest board and the menial task of fetch quest, but it's very much a step back for games as a whole, and this is one reason that the whole genre very much turns me off, and one reason I'm not a big fan of virtual worlds as an experience. In 2007, James Paul G. compiled his essays together into a really good book about learning in video games. And he puts forth like 7 principles for good educational experiences that also happen to apply to video games. And I live by these principles within my own education experiences. I'm constantly asking myself when I'm teaching these kinds of questions he puts forth. One of them is the game should be pleasantly frustrating, which sounds to be a contradiction, but that's what games run on. Mabinogi is just pretty much frustrating. I'm getting more into the flow of things, but at first it's very frustrating because most of your time is spent doing tutorial quests, and they either give you way too much detail, as someone who's played an RPG before, many RPGs. I have no problems learning basic system rules, and then at some other times they leave you hanging where you're not really sure what you're doing, or aren't very specific with details, and the player's left floundering and frustrated. Also, the quests are spread out across a very vast virtual world, and there's no real reference. I had to figure out how to get to the map myself. There was no tutorial for using the map. And then I finally found out that I had been walking forever towards this quest, for instance, that I thought I was supposed to be doing next, or I thought sounded interesting. And it turned out it was on another continent that I could not get to. That was a lot of time spent just walking within game. Not very interesting time. Some of these quests are timed, so you got to be in the right place at the right time or have aid in some way. Now, they give you a horse, at least for 7 days. I'm not sure if I'm going to have to pay for it later, but your pets are premium features for the most part. A pet that you can mount. This really helps out with the menial walking that you have to do to get from place to place, but still, that's the main part of the game. It's just walking around for like 5 hours real time, it seems like. This is definitely a big step back from well-designed video games of current time. Okay, so, are the challenges themselves well-designed? This is another question of G's. Again, I say they're fetch quests for the most part. Combat's interesting. I will say it's got an interesting combat system. It's a little innovative. I mean, this is pretty basic for most RPGs, but the way you respond is kind of different. You watch your enemies, you see what they're doing, and you pick your reaction that way. You can counterattack, you can defend. If they're defending, you can smash them. So you have to be very observant. And I think the combat system's one of the more well-planned aspects of Mabinogi. I went through a dungeon and I really got slightly challenged by it. At the same time, that was where I felt the most rewarded in the game so far was actually going and doing the classic dungeon crawler that I've been doing since I was 5 years old. I didn't feel like there was anything new to be had there, precisely. Are the game controls and the cameras intuitive and easy to use, I asked myself. Oh my goodness, no. If you look at the screenshot here, you'll see that there's a boggling number of interfaces. This was the first thing I noticed when I logged into the game. I'm pretty used to having interfaces up in my face with tons of different text going all over the place. But the number that you have to have for easy access during this game, 5, 6 panels, 7, lots of docked windows all over the place. You can choose where to dock them, but it's a lot of information that you may or may not be needing to use at the time. And the interface is very clunky. It is a point-and-click game, and it's exactly what you'd expect from that. Also using the keyboard, and for some bizarre reason that I can understand for the most part, it uses the F keys and the number keys, not the number board if you happen to have one, which would have been so much nicer. But the number keys way up there. So you end up with this very awkward wrist position if you're trying to use your number keys for most of the game that obviously you can't sustain for a very long time without smashing other keys. So that was very clunky. The mouse is very difficult to click on things. Picking things up is a big pain. You have to use Alt and Control for a lot of things, especially in combat. And there's really no camera options of which to speak. I always wanted to zoom in closer on the characters, but there's really no option to zoom more closely than very much third person, pretty far away. That's a stylistic choice, of course. It gives the environments a sense of scale because the character looks relatively small amongst it, but it's really difficult in combat. Questions I would usually ask of a game is it long enough? Is it replayable? Of course, this game, there's no end game conditions, they're completely up to the player, but the game's very customizable. I found as a benefit of, as opposed to virtual worlds like Second Life, there's a pretty good choice of avatar customizations straight out of the bat. You pay in-game currency for new stuff for your avatar for the most part. There are a few exceptions. And for instance, for about $10, you can buy a premium character that has more options for facial identities and things like that. And the pets themselves, which I mentioned before, the mount of transportation, they're about $10 a piece. Colors were one of the things that I was starting to find frustrating. It seems like sometimes if you're producing something within game, it's just a random color. Buying things, you might go to a shop one day and they're one color, and the next they're another color. And hey, you might have preferred that second color, but too bad you've already bought that first thing. And I can see where it might be used as a way to get extra play out of the game. But again, this has a chance to frustrate a player into in-game conditions of not wanting to play anymore, finding something more engaging. So to manipulate the game world in a meaningful way is something that's important to most games. So if you have a place you belong in a game, this is one of those places where we talk about video game addiction. This is why, a lot of times people don't feel like they make a big difference in the real world in their own lives. And in a game world, for the most part, you feel like you're making a big difference in a meaningful way. From the get-go, you play the hero, you play someone important, and you can solve problems that you can't solve in real-life situations. Mabinogi is not one of those games. It's one of my biggest complaints, in fact, is that while there's all this customization going on, at least not yet did I feel like I was able to manipulate the game world at all in any way that would have been helpful. I saw a few attempts to start some meaningful, quests that spanned and made some sort of difference. And, these are the larger plot quests which mark the game. But I did feel like I was actually doing things for anyone other than myself. I'm sure that these meaningful activities would have blossomed with time. And I feel like if I had had peer influence or peers in this game with me, it would have been easier to create meaningful manipulations, and it would have felt more meaningful regardless due to camaraderie. But as it was, it felt a lot like playing sports, to be honest, which is something I'm not terribly fond of. One of G's principles that I really live by as a teacher is that you need to offer information on demand and just in time for a player's needs. You don't offer a tutorial and let a span of time collapse and then say, okay, now I need you to apply this skill. As the player is is learning the skill and is applying it in bits and chunks, that's when they get information. And immediately they get to try out what they're doing. This game did some of that, but not much. The learning was offered through tutorial quests that felt quite separate from the game, even transferring you into this like training area that's separate from the game world that you would teleport back and forth from, which really disconnected me from the game world. But in general, I felt very disconnected from the game world. There was just a lot of times when the music would throw me out of the game world, or just the fact that I was walking so long, I'd have to glance up at the clock and be like, gee whiz, really? Am I still just walking? Combat, again, being very aware of the clunky mouse interface, the keyboard interface, all these things kept pulling me out of the immersion of the game. So let's talk about narrative. Is the narrative well fleshed out? I would ask that in any other game. Does it offer character agency in the story? Are the characters rich enough that the player can get system out of the characters' thoughts? Absolutely not. There are non-player characters, of course. There are lots of player characters running around that want nothing to do with you, by the way. You could ask them certain things using keywords, which is, again, like a 1980s technique of developing characters and conversation. This is not innovation here. This is a backslide. What I saw with the most potential for having some sort of narrative are the Shakespeare quests, which were going on. It seems like these quests mark the seasons for the Mabinogi servers. And of course, I'd only just got started, so I really couldn't delve into the more narrative-based quest. The Shakespeare quest, as you transfer to Avon to meet Marlowe, isn't that funny? To solve the mystery of where Shakespeare's disappeared to, and the whole mystery of this actual weird parallel, it's not even normal by fantasy standards world that, it's kind of like a prison almost. Well, Shakespeare somehow escaped and left blank folios around, and your character solves this mystery by performing them. You get into the play, you maybe put on somewhat of a costume, and then you get a cutscene of Act 1, Scene 1 Hamlet, for instance. And they're pretty good. That would be an interesting supplement for an English teacher. The Avon quest, maybe just tell them to do the Shakespeare quest. The first dungeon was not hard, so you could do it as a new character pretty quickly.
Battle after victorious battle, led by a valiant king, ushered Denmark into an era of peace. But it was not to last. For the king's sudden death cast a dark shadow, the catalyst to a tragic thread of events. The king's younger brother, Claudius, married the queen, his brother's wife, before the king was even cold in his grave. But there was one who still mourned the king, one whose tears had yet to dry. His name was Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark.
So finally, and most importantly, I want to evaluate Mabinogi's ability to support an environment of learning. The reason I picked the game at all, out of the hundreds of selections of virtual worlds that I was presented with as I browsed around the internet, was I saw on its homepage that they had classes and school, and they had a video running showing the engine on which the game runs, rendering a very impressive and relatively accurate depiction of Romeo and Juliet. So I was seeing already that there was these attempts, maybe not consciously, maybe consciously, on the game developer's part, to integrate learning and, the classical concerns of learning into the game. I wanted to explore this. So, for instance, some of the classes I saw were archaeology, which occurred on one day, astronomy on another, kinesiology on the other, physics on the fourth day that I was playing. And of course, like the rest of the game, these classes have you do these somewhat mundane, somewhat fun quest tasks that indirectly tie into the subject. So, for instance, in archaeology, you look around for things and dig up artifacts. In astronomy, you find star clusters. In kinesiology, it has you protecting a camp from zombies, so you're looking specifically at the zombie movement ratio, and so that helps you decide who to attack first, of course. Physics actually has you playing darts. So, okay, that sounds kind of silly, but if teachers, did these kind of things and scaffolded the mechanics in it, you'd have a pretty good school, I think. It doesn't take technology, for instance, to be in a physics class and say, okay, now we're going to play darts, and, as you play darts, what principles are in use and whatnot. Same thing for the other things. Doesn't an astronomy class sound cool that actually goes out and identifies stars in the night sky? All these things can be done in a traditional classroom setting, maybe with a little more money, a little more creative thought by the teacher. So that's nothing special, but yet in its own right, it is special to see that these game developers actually have a better grasp of good learning principles than most traditionally taught teachers. So you're probably wondering about the name. This was the other reason that I chose this game out of the choices, was my familiarity with the Mabinogi, which is the collection of Celtic myths. Some King Arthur ones are in there. And I still have no idea. I mean, there were, like I said, with the Shakespeare quest, and I could see that there had been other narrative events that tied into bard associations, which a Mabinogi was. So, but of course, that's obviously a loose connection because Shakespeare wasn't Celtic. But the game setting itself had a lot more to do with Irish mythology. I felt like it had a lot of potential for that I probably wasn't seeing, being that this game has been around a long time, with lots of different narrative quest arcs that I've missed, of course. So I'm curious to see overall what those connections are. I haven't gotten to that point yet. So overall, I found Mabinogi to be an okay experience. Like I say, I'm not the best one to judge it because I've never liked the genre overall, and I'm still not. I'm seeing what people see in the genre. I still don't understand why people put up with World of Warcraft when those are the very tasks they try to avoid day by day. And they get so little payoff as far as any ability to manipulate the world in real meaningful ways. Still seeing that in this game. Now, again, I say camaraderie does usually change these kind of things, but you have to be a bit of an extrovert in the first place to be able to feel the camaraderie. And introverts like myself just would rather play a single player game or a multiplayer game with people that are in the room with them. So I see potential for this to be a learning environment. I could certainly see teachers making use of the lesson plans offered in the schools. But again, I don't think you need to go into Mabinogi to do this. You could do it within the class itself, but it would probably have more meaning than getting on just to play virtual darts in your physics class. Overall, useful experience, and I do intend to keep playing for at least a bit. I am intrigued by all the different skills that I'm learning, and I feel like a smaller child would very much learn a lot of stuff passively for this game because it has a real working economy and system of manufacture where you actually shear the sheep as a task, for instance. And then you take that over to a spinning wheel and you spin thread from. Then you take that to a loom and then you create fabric from there. And then you take that fabric and with your tailoring kit, takes thread and stuff that you bought you go ahead and actually make clothing, for instance. So you can see that this would be really informative for the younger player who doesn't know how these kind of things work. Food has a similar real creation process. A lot of things do. Tools. Anything in the game you seem to be able to make pretty much from scratch, which is really cool, I think. For older players, these kind of things are going to be more passive and taken for granted. Though I am often surprised by the lack of real world knowledge a lot of people have because of industrialization. They really, really don't know what goes into the manufacture of something. So this is invaluable to teach that kind of thing. But for a child, this would be invaluable. Much like my early video game experiences in the 80s and 90s taught me these kind of things. They could teach children of today these kind of things. And unfortunately, or fortunately, much the same setting. Thanks for listening to my review for Mabinogi, and happy gaming!